me know, anyone, if it doesn't work, but hopefully it will. So I've divided my presentation into 3 sections, and basically I will start talking a little bit about the work, the person that I am, and the work that I did leading to my current job at the Whitney, where I've been for the last 7.5 years, and then exhibitions that I've done at the Whitney. Then I'm going to focus on one particular exhibition that Tamara mentioned, No Existe un Mundo Post Huracán, as not only the concept and the conceptual underpinnings of that show, but also how kind of it intersects with the broader Latinx initiative that we currently have at the museum, and how it touches on the work of really everyone at the museum, all the different departments. And lastly, the 3rd section will be about the collection, which is the second kind of area of the purview of my job at the Whitney, which is not just exhibitions, but also building the collection. And so overall, I think the presentation really touches on not just my career, but how my career kind of runs parallel to this kind of arch or moment that we've been experiencing in the US of Latinx art. Not just the only moment, of course, we know this, but lately, all the changes that have happened in the field of Latinx art in the US. And so I welcome any questions at the end. Be great to also talk about the different contexts between the US and Canada. So I'm going to start with a really corny slide that I use, and there's a reason for it. As Tamara mentioned, I think it was in my bio, I am from the island of Puerto Rico, the archipelago of Puerto Rico, and I have this sort of silly, corny slide for many reasons. I don't assume, because of experience and conversations I've had with people, not everyone knows where Puerto Rico is, and sometimes it gets confused even with Costa Rica. That's another topic, but I like to bring it up because it's a reminder of where I come from and where I sit at the museum at the Whitney as someone who comes from a colony of the US, and how my life experience is not kind of the typical one for a museum dedicated to art of the US. And not only that, but also the fact that I'm the daughter of immigrant parents, that I went to all public schools, the University of Puerto Rico, and then my graduate degrees are from the University of Wisconsin. So coming from public universities is also not very typical in the museum field, in the curatorial field, to be more precise. And so these are really great reminders of how this is not it's not hindering my career by any means. In fact, I might consider it the opposite. I think it provides an outsider perspective that can greatly benefit institutions such as the Whitney. But I'll skip through the many other places where I've worked, but just to say that in order, which might be true of many people who are in the field of in the curatorial field, at least in the US, you kind of have to move, right, to kind of uproot your life and move from city to city in order to grow in your career. And so this was very much true to me, of studying, going from Puerto Rico to Wisconsin to Houston, and then in LA. But I bring up LA and Radical Women because when I worked at the Hammer Museum around this time, and here we're talking about 2015, 2016, and I want to point out that these 2 years are kind of an important crossroads, not only in my life, but also, as I said before, kind of in the field of Latinx art. This exhibition to kind of give you a little bit of context, was part of the Pacific Standard Time initiative that the Getty Foundation organized. Now they're on their, I guess, third iteration of this Pacific Standard Time initiative. But back in before 2017, 2017 was the exhibition, but all the planning, all the research, all the implementation of the grants and putting together the exhibition was happening around 2014, 20. So almost 10 years ago, 2014, 2015. And the PSD dedicated at that moment, it was to Latin American art and Los Angeles. And many curators from Los Angeles, many Chicano and Latinx curators raised their voice and they said, how are you doing an exhibition, an initiative about Latin American art and not really including in this window, in this framework, I should say, Latinx art, knowing that Los Angeles is home to, you know, a big population of Chicano artists, especially. And so with that, the Getty kind of changed their framework a little bit to include Latinx art, but specifically in the case of Radical Women, I lived through that moment when the exhibition was initially only dedicated to art from Latin America. And we didn't really have that many artists of Latin American descent or heritage on the checklist. Even though we were, as I said before, in Los Angeles, not far, we were just a couple of miles away from, say, you know, where Patsy Valdez lived or Judy Vaca. And so the fact that we weren't really looking at them was kind of, you know, I was very young, but kind of a rude awakening of how there's this imbalance of paying more attention to Latin American art and not really paying attention to what's happening in your backyard, and these amazing artists who have for so long been ignored. And so in 2015, in addition to what's happening in LA with Pacific Standard Time, there was a study that the Mellon Foundation organized or published, I should say, that looked at the lack of diversity in museums. And specifically this figure that I'm showing, this graph, pie chart, is about race and ethnicity, as you can see, in the curatorial field and among educators and leaders. And it showed what many people were already saying, but no one had seen numbers. No one had attached numbers. There was no hard data, right, on any of this. And so in the case of Latinx curators, it showed that we represented only 3%, when among the demographics in the population in the US, we represent almost 20%. We're probably at 20 already. So this a stark contrast between the actual numbers of the population and the representation in museums. So this is happening in 2015, and I keep underscoring the year because we're almost, you know, 10 years from when this happened. So it's kind of important to trace this arch, as I said before, and see how things have moved and all the work that still needs to be done. So 2016, right after the Mellon published that study, another foundation, the Ford Foundation in this case, organized this symposium called U.S. Latinx Arts Futures at the request really of artist Teresita Fernandez, who approached, I think it was Darren Walker at the time, and asked and said, you know, we should address this. And so they organized this symposium. I was still at the Hammer. And at that time, we only had, the Whitney had an exhibition, kind of by happenstance. We had an exhibition that I'll go back to the other slide, but it was this exhibition, Carmen Herrera, organized by Dana Miller. And it's an incredible exhibition, survey of the life career of Carmen Herrera, Cuban-American artist. And because that was happening concurrently when this symposium happened, Scott Rothkopf, who you see to the right, and Adam Weinberg, the uh, uh, former director of the museum, went to this symposium, attended the symposium, and presented on Carmen Herrera. But they really heard from a lot of people, including Teresita Fernandez, the and they heard the people. They told him and them that the Whitney needed to do more, and they needed to hire an expert on Latinx art. And it wasn't enough really to do the one exhibition every couple of years, every 10 years or so. That it wasn't enough. And Scott left that symposium really humbled and um, and immediately thereafter the search for what then became my position started. And so that's kind of the backdrop of how I came to the Whitney. As I said, this exhibition happened. I came, you see there the dates. I started April 2017. And when I started the work at the Whitney, I knew, the history of the Whitney, I guess the lack of commitment and engagement with the Latinx community of artists. And in order to do my job here, I thought, I need sort of a north, or I need to be led by the words of artists, because that's a little bit, or not a little bit, that is the ethos of the museum. It's the artist museum. So when in doubt, follow the words of artists. That's kind of something that is a bit of a motto in my life and in my career. And so at the symposium, Teresita Fernandez pronounced these words that I'll quickly read to you, and to kind of to think about what we mean when we say Latinx, and what we mean when we say Latinx art and artist. So I'll read it quickly. I'm sure you've all read it by now. In Spanish, all nouns have to be either masculine or feminine, making it clumsy to have to say Latina, Latino, or exclude one or the other. The default term often becomes masculine, Latino. So Latinx is a gender-neutral alternative used by scholars, activists, and an increasing number of journalists. It is quickly gaining mainstream use as part of a linguistic revolution that aims to move beyond gender binaries and is inclusive of the intersecting identities of Latin American descendants living in the US. The term implies a new conversation, one that purposefully seeks to address the intersectionalities that Latinxes represent across race, class, and non-binary gender. As an inclusive term, it also gives a very specific space to young Latinxes. And I kind of liked these words so much because I think I would have loved to hear them when I was a student. This is not something that I was taught in university. My training was in contemporary art with a focus and emphasis on Caribbean art. So these courses didn't exist. So the idea that one could, have a framework, have a term, begin to create terminology around this, in order to look at a group of artists who have been neglected from the history of American art, was really impactful and I thought that this is really potent. This is something that can really gear and guide my work at the Whitney. So again, I like to kind of use this as an anchor for the work that I do at the Whitney. Immediately I pitched my first show, something that was very special and meaningful at the beginning, starting at the Whitney, was meeting with Thelma Golden, who was the first Black curator at the Whitney. And one thing she said that was very important was how when she started, she thought, I think the smartest thing, the right thing, the more genuine thing to do is to work with artists of my generation. And so her first show, Black Male, was, working with artists of her generation. And so I kind of follow, I love that idea of engaging with artists who, I had known from back in my time at the MFAH Houston, of listening and kind of taking the temperature of what are Latinx artists that are in my radar, in my purview, in my world. What are they thinking? What are they talking about? What are some of these ideas that are percolating among artists? And so this idea um, of being informed, of paying tribute, of also questioning the use of indigenous architecture in modern architecture, as in the work that you see here by Clarissa Tossin, but thinking about indigenous architecture not as a dead thing, but also something that can continue to be alive through the work of contemporary artists was something that I felt a lot of artists were talking about. And so with that, I set out to do, this was my first show at the Whitney, an exhibition, a group show with 7 artists, all of them born outside of the US, but all of them came at different stages in their lives, some when they were babies, others when they were a little older, but all working in the US and addressing issues that had to do with indigenous architecture, indigenous space, but also the relationship between those in the US and how it's still kept alive through Latinx people and indigenous people in this country. And so then I continued, I collaborated with Barbara Haskell, who's a very seasoned curator at the Whitney. I had the immense pleasure of working with her and learning from her. And so this exhibition, Vida Americana, which sadly it opened a month before the pandemic, and so not a lot of people saw, but it was really powerful in kind of examining this idea of American exceptionalism in art and how this the myth of post-war art, of Jackson Pollock, that really had a history, that really had a precedent in the work that the Mexican muralist did in the US right after the end of the Mexican Revolution, after they had commissions to do public artwork in Mexico had dwindled. They came to the US. The 3 main muralists, Rivera, Orozco, Siqueiros, came to the US to make public artworks. That inspired the WPA, and a lot of younger artists like Guston and Pollock trained and saw the work of these artists. And so then you have kind of, so it's a rewriting of that period of the 30s, 40s, 50s. So that it was a really great exhibition to kind of think about and reframe some ideas that we have around post-war art, especially. And then I had the pleasure, and this part is also important to mention. When I started at the Whitney, it wasn't just my expertise and knowledge of Latinx art, but I immediately started working with emerging artists. So at the museum, we have something we have working groups, and I heard that other museums also have these different types of working groups. And so we have an emerging artist working group that is it's made up of some curators at the museum and people from other departments, but it's basically a kind of a group, a think tank, if you will, of us who are thinking about not only, we tend to work with a lot of emerging artists during the biennials, but what is the program? How are we showing and giving a platform to emerging artists when we don't have biennials necessarily? So in that period, interim period between biennials, how are we still showing emerging artists, and how is that, and it should be part of kind of our identity as the museum. I think that's something that we're known for. And so as part of the emerging artists working group, we tend to curate some specific spaces in the museum, including the billboard. We have a billboard right outside of the museum across the museum. And so I got to work with Martine Gutierrez, who's a trans artist and activist, and she created this mural. And she's someone who's always kind of poking fun and toying and flirting and um, using a lot of wit and humor to talk about uh, gender phobias and transphobia and sexism and racism in not just art, but in like visual culture in general. And so with her, we did this billboard. She also did a great performance. And so it was a lot of fun to work with Martine. I often say that Martine is everything, and I don't say everything in the she's everything kind of like millennial speak, but more like she is everything, but she also does everything. Like her projects are, she is the author in so many different ways, and so that's also an important thing. She has total agency of um, the photograph, the direction, the styling, the makeup, the editorial. Everything is done by Martine. And then I'll save more words for about No Existe un Mundo Post Huracán. In a little bit, I'll go into this exhibition. But this was then a really big group show that I had started working on in what was it, 2019, and then it went on beyond 2022. The first idea started in 2017. I'll get into that. But just so that you know, that understand, as many of you might be curators and might work at different institutions, but we're always working on several different projects depending on the scale. But we're all working on more than one show at the same time. So, you know, when I was doing Vida Americana, I was already working on this show. So just so you have kind of a more 360 view of what it is, of the work. And then right after that, I worked with Angelica Arbeláez on this exhibition by Lana Sabdi, who also is an emerging artist, and that came through our kind of emerging artist program. An incredible painter, and it's hard, her images online don't pay justice to what the work is in real life, but there are areas here that are they're very tactile. Those are covered in beeswax, so there's a lot of texture, very thick in some parts and very kind of almost watery, aqueous in some other parts. And then we have this is the newest show that I just opened a couple last week. And I have a digital rendering because we still don't have the official installation shots. But basically this room looks a lot like this. It's really incredible what the digital rendering can do. But it's a show called Shifting Landscapes. It's the first time that I'm working with the collection. So this is a collection exhibition. As you can see, it's going to be up for 15 months. So I'm sure many of you will have a chance to see it. And it's a show, we're looking at the idea, the genre of landscapes, and how, if you look at our collection, at the Whitney's collection, which has 26,000 objects, if you look at our collection, you would see so many definitions of what a landscape is. And so for this show, we narrow it down to 7 definitions so there are 7 different sections of what we consider to be landscapes, strong landscapes that are in our collection. And we thought that this would be a really great opportunity to show many of our new acquisitions. And, you know, I'll say more about collecting at the Whitney in just a little bit, but 70% of the artists, of the works here, I should say, of the works were acquired in the last 5 years. So it's a kind of an opportunity. It's one of these shows of like new acquisitions without calling it that. And many, I think I did the math, and it's about almost 40% of the artists in the show. There's 120 artists. sorry, 80 artists, 120 works, 80 artists. Almost 40% of those 80 artists are Latinx artists. So it kind of shows all the work that we've been doing collectively at this institution for the last 7 years. So in many ways, I consider it a triumph. And these works that you see here, hopefully you can see my pointer. This is a work by Amalia Mesa Baines, Teresita Fernandez, James Luna, Luis Jimenez, Guadalupe Maravilla, and there's a codex by Enrique Chagoya. Some beautiful works. So now I wanted to transition to No Existe un Mundo Post Huracán, because, and I'll show the slide here, because it's a show that I mean, maybe I said it before, I'm really proud of. It really took everything I had in me. It was a very kind of biographical exhibition, very emotional exhibition, and it's also an example of something that we realized early on when I started working, when we did Pacha, that first show. And I give the credit to Scott here, because he noticed that we can do exhibitions on Latinx art, we can acquire works by Latinx artists, but if the museum, if the other departments don't understand what we're doing, then it's not going to have an impact. It's going to be a box that we check every so often. And so in 5 years, or less than 5 years, we kind of course corrected. And so we were more intentional about every single aspect of the show. And I'll just mention briefly, the Pacha was the first bilingual show in the history of the museum. So ever since Pacha, we have started adding more bilingual labels to our exhibition. By the end of by June 2025, all of our exhibitions will be bilingual. But with No Existe un Mundo Post Huracán, everything was, all the extended, all the object labels, all the section text, the intro text, everything. In addition to that, we had audio guides with the artists speaking in their own language. So not kind of forcing them to describe their work in English necessarily. The marketing was for everyone that we typically market to, which are, enthusiasts of contemporary art, but also to the strong Puerto Rican community in New York. We did a teacher exchange between teachers from the public school system in New York and teachers in Puerto Rico. We are in the process of publishing the catalog. There was a catalog, so we already have a downloadable Spanish version of the catalog, which we're going to print, and that's going to come out very soon. But the catalog is in Spanish, all of it, and you can download it for free. I mean, there's so much press. There was a lot of engagement with Spanish-speaking press. So every single angle, I like to think of it from that it was a really holistic exhibition, where we thought about everything, and it became kind of a playbook, if you will, kind of a guide for how to curate any exhibition with a Latinx kind of lens, but specifically, exhibitions that have Latinx content, like Shifting Landscapes, which I just mentioned. And so briefly, the show was about, well, the hurricane that happened on September 20th, 2017. It was a Category 5 hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. It was downgraded to Category 4. It was one of the most devastating events that have happened in the history of Puerto Rico. And I was in New York. I had just arrived. It's a longer story, but I had just given birth. I was in my home with my dad in Puerto Rico. My mom was helping me. It was really catastrophic to see mediated through the internet, all these terrible scenes and kind of the very narrow way in which Puerto Rico and the hurricane was covered by the media, and the frustration um, at seeing those images and not seeing more to that story of not and understanding that that's what Americans were consuming. When in reality, when you talked to people on the island, the story was more nuanced. It was even more tragic in many ways, but there was also a lot of other emotions, there's a lot of um, help that was arriving from the diaspora to Puerto Rico. People were without light for months, and I'll talk briefly about that, for almost a year in some parts. So it was a very nuanced, very complicated a picture that wasn't really being told in the media. And so from that frustration, from wanting to do something for my country, for thinking about how do you restore the emotions, the poetry, the feelings behind this? How do you really represent that in an exhibition? That was really the question. Um, and so in the course of the research, I thought, well, this exhibition in reality won't be able to happen until 2022, which happens to be the 5th anniversary of the hurricane. And so I was already doing studio visits and kind of thinking, or not thinking, but seeing how artists were processing this moment. And so I wasn't really interested in how artists depicted literally the hurricane, but more of how they were processing all of everything that was happening in the aftermath of the hurricane. And so I started meeting with artists, doing studio visits. At the end, I worked with 20 artists. The first artist who I invited was actually a poet, and that's where the title for the show comes from. It's a verse from a poetry book, because I think I wanted to signal through the title that this wasn't an exhibition where you would see, this porno misery of devastation and catastrophe, but you're going to see poetry and you're going to see feelings and ideas and kind of uh, different textures of emotions, from sadness and frustration and anger to sometimes moments of joy, of helping your neighbor, of coming together to fight for the same cause, of humor. I wanted to show that entire tapestry of feelings. And so with the first work that this is how you enter the exhibition, which was a video by Sofia Cordova. And I chose this video to open the exhibition because it's from the first person, or from the perspective of a family in Puerto Rico. It's an average family in many ways, middle class family from Puerto Rico, narrating the day of the hurricane. That's how the video starts, the night of the hurricane. And then afterwards, Sofia follows them and has really candid conversations with them, at the same time weaving very poetic moments where there's no resolution really. They're more kind of ephemeral moments that she captures with her camera. And so that's how the show opened. One other thing that I want to mention, that was really transformative for the museum, was that we set out to acquire the works of all 20 artists who were in the show. That set out a precedent for the museum, because before that, our group shows tend to be the biennial, where you have 60 artists, which is kind of impossible to acquire all of them. But because this exhibition was so important for the record and the history of the museum, we wanted to create a record of the show by acquiring the work of all 20 artists. I say 20, but it's really 19, because one of the artists was Raquel Salas Rivera, Raquel Salas Rivera, who is a poet, and he lent the verse for the title of the show. And so in his case, we acquired an artist book that he made with a couple of other collaborators. Here are the artists. I like to bring them with me when I talk about this show because there he is, Raquel. And but yes, we acquired that artist book, but then we acquired the works of all of the other 19 artists. They're currently in the collection. And so this is the book I mentioned already, where the verse, where the title comes from. And and the work that opened the show, this is Sofia Cordova. Next to Sofia Cordova's work was the installation of Edra Soto. This is also now in the collection, which is a fence that she makes. It's part of a series, longer, bigger series called Graft. And in many ways, it's a kind of a fence, concrete fence that you find in front of many houses, especially kind of lower middle class homes in Puerto Rico. Very similar to the homes that you see in Sofia Cordova's video, but inserted in every little single hole there that you see is a mirror. And then inside of that little viewfinder, you see a photograph. These are photographs that Edra took the day after the hurricane, which she didn't want to blow up or show without any context, but kind of by making them so small and so intimate, you kind of engage in this unspoken contract between you and her of like, I'm showing you something very intimate. This is my home, right? Because this is a fence that covers someone's home, and I'm inviting you into my home. So there's this unspoken kind of contract of intimacy between you and the artist when you see this work. And then we had 5 sections. This is just one work, fractured infrastructure. It's a found object, very much in the tradition of the objet trouvé, right, in art. So it's a found object. In this case, it's a lamp post that had this sign that says Valora tu ciudadanía americana, value your American citizenship, because in Puerto Rico, they like to do these referendums. There was just one a couple of days ago of asking Puerto Ricans, what do they want? Do they want independence, statehood, or the current state, which is a commonwealth? And people are just tired. And so the position of the lamppost is this sagging kind of forever tiredness. I'm not sure what the word is, of exhaustion, of a frustration at a government that is not looking for your best interest. There was no power, as I said before, for almost a year in many parts of Puerto Rico. My parents are in San Juan, which is the capital. They didn't get power until like 3 months after the hurricane. So the situation is dire. There are still blackouts. So this is not meaning something that was fixed even a year after. No, there are still blackouts. It's an ongoing condition more than a situation. It's an ongoing condition. This imbalance of power between the US and Puerto Rico. Critiques of tourism. I don't have the caption here, but it's a work by Guillo Tirado, the one that you see here, Rogelio Baez Vega, Sofia Gallizá. But critiques of tourism was a section where we were talking about the fact that so many Puerto Ricans left Puerto Rico right after in 2019. Around 2019, the population really decreased. At the same time, the government was creating these very lucrative tax loopholes, incentives for foreigners, especially Americans, to move to Puerto Rico. And so they're buying tons of properties by the sea. There's a lot of development happening. People are not, the prices are going up. This is happening in other parts of the world, of course. Prices are going up. People are not being able to, rent an apartment or a house for their families. So they're moving inland. Meanwhile, this, development is happening, continues to happen. No concern for the environment, And so this piece by Gillo alludes to that, and also to the fact that the hurricane really caused coastal erosion. And so in addition, when you add the hurricane plus really aggressive development, there's not going to be any coast, and sand's going to be on top of you, quite literally, very, very soon. Processing, grieving, and reflecting, and I have a little video of this installation, how it was installed. We wanted here to talk about it was a very difficult section, but we couldn't ignore it, and that was the deaths that happened after the hurricane, either as a direct consequence or indirect consequence. The number that resonates in people's minds is 4,645 deaths. It's both quite a literal number, but also a symbolic number. And in this case, this work that you see here that Gabriela is doing, these are all photographs from photo albums that they have with their father when he was still alive, almost at the 1 year anniversary of the hurricane. Their father committed suicide. That was also something that public health agencies were documenting, the huge rise in suicides that happened after the hurricane. And sadly, their dad was one of them. And in the show, we have that platform that you see there with these photos that they weave this red thread through them, creating these really beautiful bonds of not just, bloodlines that are shared between child and parent, but also, the connection that's between them. And many of the photographs, what I love about them is that they're of them at the beach. And the beach is so important. Also, just coming from the critiques of tourism section, the beach is a sort of habitat. It is a habitat. It's a habitat for Puerto Ricans. It's not just leisure. It's a place where you make culture, where you make life, where your family goes every weekend. And so it's anyway, very important. Gabriela had another platform, another work where you saw objects that belonged to their father. And through those objects, you got a sense, like a three-dimensional sense of who this person was, that he enjoyed sailing, that he liked Led Zeppelin, that, he was an avid photographer. You got a sense of someone. Of those 4,645, at least you have a sense of who one person was. And so it's a really powerful. There's two projects that Gabriela presented. And then ecology and landscapes was a really kind of section that we showed a lot of abstract works. I kind of wanted to go against the expected trope of the Caribbean as a tropical paradise where you go to drink piña coladas. So I wanted to think about the ecology, about science, and how it really affected the environment. And then lastly, the last section was about resistance and protest. In 2019, finally, 2 years after the hurricane, people were totally fed up with the government. The governor back then made really terrible remarks and comments about the people of Puerto Rico, about the deaths of Maria, and that was just the straw that broke the camel's back. People went out to the streets and protested, and this artist, Garvin Sierra, created these were digital, Instagram posts. All of this, everything you see here was an Instagram post at one moment, and we had these screens embedded to show the original posts and how people interacted. And so you can see the comments, and you can see in some of them that because he's so good with images, he distills one idea into very simple elements. There's an economy of symbols and colors in his work, and people immediately got it. They immediately knew what he was referring to. So it becomes sort of a timeline of that history of Puerto Rico at that precise moment. And so in the comments, you can see people laughing, people frustrated, people kind of screaming. And so you can see again that tapestry of emotions very well recorded in this project. And then lastly, a work by Gabriela Salazar, who's kind of a land art artist, I want to say, but contemporary, bringing a little bit of the architecture of Puerto Rico with the architecture of New York. And then Awilda Sterling Dupre, who's a performance artist. So just to say here briefly that all the mediums were represented. That was also really important. It was a very intergenerational exhibition. With most of the artists representing artists from the archipelago of Puerto Rico, 11 of them, and then 9 of them of the diaspora, because contrary to exhibitions from the past that have focused on Puerto Rican art, there's been a very kind of like contrast between the diaspora and Puerto Rico. And so I wanted to really bring them together. And this is something that I think the new generation of Puerto Rican curators are really understanding, that Puerto Rico is not just the people in Puerto Rico, but actually the diaspora, which is bigger, especially in the States. And I want to be mindful of time, but I want to quickly talk about the collection and how the efforts at building the collection and addressing a huge area of the collection that had been neglected, of how we neglected to collect Latinx artists. And so this pie chart, I love pie charts, that I'm going to show reflect as you can see, Latinx artworks in the collection pre-2015. So when I say pre-2015, you have to imagine from 1931 to 2015. And then everything after 2015, so in the less than 10 years, what we've collected. We've collected more in the last 10 years than in 85 years of the museum. You might be wondering why 2015. 2015 is the moment when we moved to the new building. It happened, if you think back again to that 2015, 2016 crossroads that I mentioned, it points back to that. And then I wanted to kind of zoom in on just last year, 2023. Of all the works that were collected in 2023, we collected almost, I guess if you round it up, 16% of the works were by Latinx artists. So that is a considerable, a significant piece of the pie. And these are, you might be wondering how do we collect? It's kind of simple. We either buy works, we acquire works, we purchase works through acquisition funds that are medium specific. So in this case is the painting and sculpture. We have 5 committees: painting and sculpture, photography, film and video, digital art, and drawings and prints. Either we buy through those committees, or someone might offer us a gift, and there's a process, obviously, to whether we accept it or not. But that's yet another way in which we collect works. So I always like to talk about this because before I started working in museums, everything looked so mysterious and so shrouded in silence, and like almost a very small exclusive group of people had access to that knowledge, and there's no reason for it to be that way. This is not something that you are taught in high school or in college. And so I like to demystify these processes and how museums work. That's really something that I would have liked to hear when I was a student. And also one other note about these 2 works that happen to be of 2 artists named with last name Martinez, but these 2 works are in shifting landscapes. So these are part of those works that were recently acquired that went immediately into this show. And then we have public programs. I think the pandemic was really tragic, obviously in many, many ways, but Zoom, and we're still in this beautiful medium of Zoom that brings people from really afar together. And in our case, because public program was one of these departments where we could actually do something really quickly, we did this series of book conversation, book launches. And so we talked with the authors, and these, like this conversation right now, it was recorded and they're all on YouTube. And we also have a partnership with the For the Melon and the US Latinx Art Forum, where we have a Zoom conversation with a group of the Latinx Artist Fellowship of that cohort that is selected every year. And so there are 15 selected every year, 15 artists, sorry. And so we had, in this case, in this year, a conversation with Leslie Martinez, Amalia Mesa Baines, and Tania Guiniga. And just so kind of to tie in and piece everything together, when we had this conversation, Leslie and Amalia were not in the collection yet, or neither Tania, and that's something that I want to work on, but Leslie and Amalia are now in the collection. So this is the type of work that I've been describing, and how you want go from point A to point B. And lastly, I think it's important to also listen to other definitions, to other thinkers, of how to, always be flexible with your frameworks. And so in the case of Latinx art, I'm constantly reevaluating what that means through the specific context of the Whitney. And so this quote by Sofia Cordova is very inspiring. And so it's also a reminder, both Teresita and her words are really important in the work that I do. I'll just read it and then I'll finish there. I want to take this question of what is the X, and I don't know. I want it to be a black hole. I want it to be infinite. I want it to be a place for things that I haven't imagined yet, that any of us haven't imagined yet. I want it to be a place of possibility, a place of struggle, a place of encounter, a garbage can, a utopia. I want it to be all these things because as we're emerging, as these terms are emerging, even in their clunkiness, it signifies that there is a desire to have conversations that bind us across things that we need to band together around. I hope that within its Xness, there is this provocation to consider fluidity in all of its forms, gender, race, class, etc. Okay, so with that, I'm going to finish.